There's something almost mystical about the moment when everything you've ever wanted seems to materialize before your eyes. It was a few years ago when I first encountered him, this young assistant pastor in his early 30s who seemed to embody every prayer I'd whispered into the darkness of lonely nights. He possessed that rare combination of spiritual depth and worldly charm that made him magnetic in ways that felt both sacred and dangerous. The first time I saw him speak, there was something in his presence that commanded attention without demanding it. His voice carried the kind of authority that comes from genuine conviction, or what I believed was genuine conviction. He spoke about redemption, about second chances, about the beauty of imperfect people finding perfect love. Every word seemed crafted specifically for the wounded parts of my heart that I'd been carrying around like old scars. I found myself attending services more frequently, not necessarily for God, but for the possibility of glimpsing him again. There's a particular kind of anticipation that builds when you're drawn to someone who represents everything you've convinced yourself you need, not just want, but need on a cellular level. He represented stability, purpose, spiritual grounding, and the kind of love that poets write about and romantics chase their entire lives. The early days of our connection felt like stepping into a warm bath after years in the cold. He paid attention to me in ways that made me feel seen, truly seen, perhaps for the first time in my adult life. Our conversations meandered through theology and philosophy, through dreams and fears, through the kind of vulnerable territory that most people avoid but that creates the strongest bonds when navigated together. For 5 or 6 months, our relationship built like a slow-burning fire. There was something intoxicating about the pace, deliberate, thoughtful, weighted with meaning. Every interaction felt significant, every shared glance charged with possibility. He seemed to understand my need for depth, for connection that went beyond the surface-level interactions that had defined most of my previous relationships. He listened when I spoke about my desire for partnership, for someone who would choose me fully and completely. He nodded knowingly when I shared my frustrations with casual dating, with men who seemed incapable of commitment, with the endless cycle of hope and disappointment that had become my romantic life. He presented himself as someone who understood those desires because he shared them, someone who was also searching for something real and lasting. The physical intimacy, when it finally happened, felt like the natural culmination of everything we'd been building together. It wasn't rushed or casual, it felt like a sacred act between two people who had found something rare and precious. In those moments, I felt chosen in a way I'd never experienced before. I felt like I was exactly where I belonged, with exactly the person I was meant to be with. But even in those early stages, there were small inconsistencies that my intuition registered but my conscious mind dismissed. Phone calls that went unanswered for days with explanations that felt slightly rehearsed. Conversations that seemed to circle around certain topics without ever landing on them. A quality of attention that felt both intense and somehow distant, as if he was studying me rather than simply being with me. I told myself these were the natural anxieties of someone who had been hurt before, someone who was perhaps too eager to find problems where none existed. I convinced myself that real love required trust, required giving someone the benefit of the doubt, required quieting the small voice that whispered warnings I didn't want to hear. The discovery came in the way these revelations often do, not as a dramatic confrontation or a smoking gun, but as a series of small cracks that eventually shattered the entire foundation. A name mentioned casually by someone else. A timeline that didn't quite add up. A social media post that contradicted something he'd told me about his whereabouts. The first woman I discovered felt like a punch to the solar plexus. Not just because she existed, but because of how obviously serious their relationship was. Photos, shared experiences, the kind of casual intimacy that only comes from extended time together. But that was just the beginning of an excavation that would eventually uncover an entire archaeological site of deception. As I dug deeper, and I did dig, with the obsessive determination of someone whose entire reality has been called into question, the scope of his betrayals became almost incomprehensible. Not just multiple women, but an astronomical number. Not just casual encounters, but sustained relationships with women who, like me, believed they were special, believed they were the ones he'd been waiting for. Each new discovery felt like another death, another small murder of the person I'd believed myself to be. The woman who was smart enough to recognize deception, strong enough to demand honesty, valuable enough to inspire faithfulness. With each revelation, that woman became more and more of a fiction, replaced by someone who had been thoroughly and systematically deceived by someone she'd trusted completely. The pattern that emerged was both sophisticated and devastating. He had perfected the art of making each woman feel uniquely understood, uniquely valued. He studied what they needed to hear and delivered it with the precision of someone who had turned emotional manipulation into a finely tuned instrument. What I had experienced as genuine connection was actually the product of careful observation and calculated response. As the full scope of his betrayals became clear, I began to understand that what I'd experienced wasn't an aberration, it was his normal operating procedure. The research I conducted with the desperate thoroughness of someone trying to make sense of senselessness revealed a pattern that stretched back to his teenage years. His first wife, the relationships that followed, the countless women who had believed themselves to be special, all had experienced variations of the same careful seduction followed by the same devastating betrayal. He had been perfecting this approach since he was 18 years old, which meant that by the time I encountered him, he was operating with nearly 15 years of experience in emotional manipulation. Understanding this timeline was both validating and horrifying. Validating because it confirmed that what I'd experienced was real manipulation, not a failure of judgment on my part. Horrifying because it revealed the scope of damage he'd inflicted, not just on me but on dozens of other women who had trusted him with their hearts and their bodies. The most disturbing aspect wasn't just the number of women, but the consistency of his approach. The same careful attention to what each woman needed to hear, the same patient building of trust, the same exploitation of that trust once it was established. What I had experienced as a unique connection was actually a well-rehearsed performance, delivered with the conviction of someone who had learned exactly which emotional buttons to push. This revelation transformed my understanding of our entire relationship. Every moment that had felt sacred was revealed to be strategic. Every vulnerability I'd shared had been catalogued and potentially used against me. Every promise about the future had been a lie told with the confidence of someone who had told the same lies countless times before. A year later, just as I was beginning to construct some semblance of peace with what had happened, another revelation shattered whatever equilibrium I'd managed to achieve. He was engaged. Not just dating someone new, but preparing to marry her, to make the same promises to her that he'd made to me and broken without apparent conscience. The engagement felt like a personal assault, a public declaration that whatever he'd shared with me hadn't been valuable enough to preserve, but whatever he shared with her was worth a lifetime commitment. The rational part of my mind understood that this was likely another deception, another performance in a long-running show. But the wounded part of my heart experienced it as a confirmation of my own inadequacy. The decision to inform his fiancée was not made lightly or quickly. It came after weeks of internal debate, of weighing the potential consequences against the moral imperative I felt to prevent another woman from experiencing what I'd experienced. I crafted an anonymous message that included enough verifiable details to be credible while protecting my own identity. Her response was perhaps more devastating than his original betrayal. Rather than gratitude for the information, rather than questions about the details, she treated me as if I was nothing more than a bitter ex-lover trying to sabotage her happiness. She dismissed me as worthless, as trashy, as someone whose pain was irrelevant compared to her desire to believe in the fantasy he'd constructed for her. The wedding proceeded as planned, and I watched from a distance as he achieved what appeared to be the perfect life with someone who had chosen to ignore everything that should have made that perfection impossible. He had managed to convince her that whatever truth I'd shared was less valuable than whatever lies he'd told her. The months following their wedding were perhaps the darkest period of this entire experience. Every day felt like a constant reminder of what I'd lost and what I'd never had. He had moved seamlessly from our relationship to his engagement to his marriage, as if the devastation he'd left in his wake was simply the cost of doing business. Meanwhile, I remained alone, struggling to rebuild not just my ability to trust others but my ability to trust myself. The woman who had believed herself capable of recognizing deception, of inspiring faithfulness, of deserving honesty, that woman had been revealed as a fiction. In her place was someone whose judgment had been completely compromised, whose value had been thoroughly questioned, whose future had been indefinitely postponed. The isolation was compounded by the particular nature of the betrayal. How do you explain to friends and family that you're struggling to recover from a relationship that, from the outside, appeared to last only a few months? How do you articulate the depth of damage caused by someone who was never technically yours to begin with? How do you mourn the loss of a future that was apparently never real? The practical implications were equally devastating. At an age when many of my peers were settling into marriages and starting families, I found myself back at square one, unable to trust my own judgment enough to pursue new relationships, unable to believe that anyone would choose me over the easier options available to them. The biological clock that had been merely background noise became a constant reminder of opportunities that were slipping away while I remained paralyzed by fear and doubt. Watching him build his new life felt like being forced to witness someone else living in the house you'd designed, wearing the clothes you'd picked out, enjoying the future you'd planned. Every social media post, every mutual acquaintance's casual mention of his happiness, every glimpse of his apparent contentment felt like salt in wounds that refused to heal. The anger that developed wasn't the clean, simple anger of someone who'd been obviously wronged. It was complicated, layered, shot through with self-doubt and shame. Part of me was furious at him for his deception, for his casual cruelty, for the way he'd used my deepest desires against me. But another part was furious at myself for being deceived, for not seeing through his performance, for continuing to care about someone who had proven himself unworthy of care. The rage became a constant companion, coloring every interaction, influencing every decision. It was exhausting to carry that much anger, but it also felt necessary, like the only thing standing between me and complete emotional collapse. The anger confirmed that what had happened to me mattered, that I had a right to feel violated, that his actions had consequences even if he never acknowledged them. But the anger also became a prison. It kept me connected to him in ways that prevented me from moving forward. Every time I thought about his happiness, his successful marriage, his apparent immunity to consequences, the rage would flare up again, as fresh and consuming as if the betrayal had happened yesterday. The unfairness of it all became an obsession. He had caused tremendous damage, not just to me but to countless other women, and yet he'd managed to construct a life that appeared blessed, successful, enviable. Meanwhile, I remained stuck, unable to move forward, unable to trust, unable to believe that I deserved the kind of love and commitment that he was apparently capable of giving to someone else. The information about his potential childhood trauma arrived like a grenade thrown into an already complicated emotional landscape. The suggestion that he might have been molested or abused as a child by a pastor, someone in a position of trust similar to the one he later occupied, introduced a dimension of complexity that I wasn't prepared to handle. Suddenly, the clear lines between victim and perpetrator, between innocent and guilty, between justified anger and cruel revenge, became blurred beyond recognition. If he had been damaged by someone else's cruelty, if his behavior was the result of trauma rather than simple moral failure, what did that mean for my anger? What did it mean for my decision to expose him? What did it mean for the way I'd been thinking about justice and accountability? The possibility of his victimization didn't erase the reality of mine, but it complicated my understanding of both. It raised questions I wasn't equipped to answer. At what point does being a victim stop excusing victimizing others? How do we balance compassion for someone's pain with accountability for the pain they've caused? Is it possible to hold both truths simultaneously, that someone can be both wounded and wounding, both deserving of compassion and requiring of consequences? These questions kept me awake at night, turning over scenarios and possibilities, trying to find a framework that could contain all the contradictions. If he had been abused, did that make my anger inappropriate? If trauma had shaped his behavior, did that diminish the validity of my pain? If he was operating from his own place of damage, what did that mean for the women he damaged in turn? The struggle between holding him accountable and extending compassion became a daily internal battle that exhausted me in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Part of me wanted to maintain the clarity of my anger, the certainty that he was simply a bad person who deserved whatever consequences his actions had brought him. That version of the story was clean, comprehensible, and allowed me to maintain my position as the innocent victim of someone else's cruelty. But another part of me, perhaps the part that had been drawn to him in the first place because of his apparent capacity for redemption and growth, couldn't ignore the possibility that his story was more complicated than I'd understood. If he had been damaged by abuse, if his behavior was a reenactment of trauma rather than a choice made from a place of wholeness, then my response needed to account for that complexity. The questions multiplied. Had I crossed a line by exposing him without knowing the full scope of his story? Was my pursuit of justice actually a form of revenge that perpetuated the cycle of harm? If he was acting from his own unhealed wounds, did that make my wounds less significant? Could I hold space for both my legitimate anger and compassion for his potential pain? This internal wrestling match was perhaps more exhausting than the original betrayal because it offered no clear resolution, no moment of clarity that would allow me to move forward with confidence. Instead, it kept me suspended in a state of moral uncertainty, unable to fully embrace either righteous anger or compassionate forgiveness. As months turned into years, I began to recognize that my fixation on him, on his happiness, on the fairness or unfairness of our respective outcomes, was consuming my life in ways that served no productive purpose. The energy I was spending on anger and resentment was energy I wasn't spending on healing, on growth, on building the kind of life I actually wanted to live. The rage had become comfortable in its familiarity, but it was also keeping me trapped in a version of myself that I didn't want to be permanently. The woman who defined herself primarily in relation to someone who had hurt her, who measured her worth against someone else's apparent success, who remained frozen in time while life continued to move forward around her. I began to understand that holding on to the anger wasn't protecting me from further hurt, it was preventing me from experiencing anything else. Every new person I met was filtered through the lens of my betrayal. Every potential relationship was sabotaged by my inability to trust. Every opportunity for joy was diminished by my preoccupation with someone else's undeserved happiness. The recognition that my anger was harming me more than it was harming him was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it suggested that I had more control over my experience than I'd believed. Terrifying because it meant that continuing to suffer was, in some sense, a choice I was making rather than a fate that had been imposed upon me. Perhaps the most confusing aspect of my ongoing struggle was the realization that I was jealous of his wife's position, even though I knew intellectually that I wouldn't actually want to be married to someone capable of such systematic deception. The rational part of my mind understood that she hadn't won some prize that should have been mine. She'd inherited a problem that I'd been lucky to escape. But rationality proved insufficient against the deeper emotional currents that drove my jealousy. What I envied wasn't necessarily him specifically, but what he represented, being chosen, being committed to, being considered worthy of permanence. The fact that his choice was probably meaningless, that his commitment was likely as hollow as all his previous commitments, couldn't quiet the part of me that had always struggled with feeling like someone's second choice. This jealousy revealed something uncomfortable about my own psychology, about patterns that predated my relationship with him. The tendency to measure my worth by whether someone was willing to commit to me, the fear of being disposable, the desperate need to be someone's first and only choice. These weren't issues he'd created, but vulnerabilities he'd exploited. Understanding this pattern was both humbling and empowering. Humbling because it revealed that my reaction to his betrayal was about more than just his betrayal. It was about lifelong insecurities that made me particularly susceptible to this kind of manipulation. Empowering because it suggested that healing would require more than just getting over him, it would require addressing the underlying beliefs about my own worth that had made his validation feel so essential. One of the most persistent questions throughout this entire experience has been about the nature of justice and accountability. If he was acting from his own place of trauma, if his behavior was the result of damage rather than deliberate cruelty, what did that mean for the question of consequences? Did understanding his potential victimization require excusing his perpetration? The more I've thought about this question, the more I've come to believe that compassion and accountability aren't mutually exclusive. It's possible to have empathy for someone's pain while still insisting that they take responsibility for the pain they've caused others. It's possible to understand that hurt people while still maintaining that hurt people are responsible for getting help instead of spreading their hurt around. In some ways, the possibility of his childhood trauma makes his adult behavior more tragic rather than less culpable. If he was damaged by abuse, then he of all people should understand the impact of using power to exploit vulnerability. His potential victimization should have made him more sensitive to the harm caused by manipulation and betrayal, not more skilled at inflicting it. The decision to inform his fiancée, viewed through this lens, wasn't an act of revenge but an act of harm reduction. Regardless of what had been done to him, he was continuing to cause damage to others. Breaking that cycle required intervention, required someone willing to speak truth even when that truth was unwelcome. Real healing, I've discovered, doesn't follow the neat narrative arc that self-help books and motivational speeches suggest. It's not a linear progression from pain to acceptance to growth. Instead, it's a spiral process where the same issues resurface repeatedly, each time requiring a slightly different response, each time offering an opportunity for deeper understanding. Some days, I feel like I've achieved genuine peace with what happened, like I've integrated the experience into a larger story about resilience and growth. Other days, something small, a song, a phrase, a glimpse of his continuing happiness, can send me spiraling back into the same rage and confusion I felt in the immediate aftermath of the betrayal. The work of healing has required me to examine not just what he did to me, but what I brought to the situation that made me vulnerable to that particular kind of manipulation. It's required me to look honestly at my own patterns, my own needs, my own tendency to lose myself in the promise of being chosen by someone who seemed to offer everything I thought I wanted. This self-examination has been humbling and sometimes painful, but it's also been empowering. Understanding my own vulnerabilities has helped me develop better boundaries, better instincts, better questions to ask both of potential partners and of myself. It's helped me recognize that the desire to be chosen is healthy, but the willingness to accept being chosen by just anyone, regardless of their character or intentions, is not. Even now, years later, I don't have clean answers to all the questions this experience has raised. I still don't know for certain whether he was abused as a child, though the possibility continues to complicate my feelings about him and about my own response to his behavior. I still don't know whether informing his fiancée was the right thing to do, though I believe it was necessary. What I do know is that holding on to certainty about his motives, his character, or his future has been less important than finding peace with the uncertainty. I may never understand why he did what he did, or whether he's capable of change, or whether his marriage will survive the patterns that destroyed his previous relationships. But I'm learning that I don't need those answers to move forward with my own life. The questions that matter more are the ones I can actually influence. How do I want to show up in my relationships going forward? What boundaries do I need to maintain to protect myself from similar manipulation? How can I honor my own pain while not allowing it to define my entire existence? How can I remain open to love while being smarter about recognizing when that openness is being exploited? Forgiveness, I've learned, is not what I thought it was. It's not a feeling of benevolence towards someone who has wronged you, and it's not a declaration that what they did was acceptable or understandable. It's not even necessarily a decision you make once and then live by forever. Instead, forgiveness seems to be an ongoing practice of releasing the demand that the past be different than it was. It's a decision to stop giving someone who hurt you continued power over your present and future. It's a recognition that holding on to anger and resentment hurts you more than it hurts them, and a commitment to your own healing over your attachment to their suffering. This understanding of forgiveness allows for complexity in ways that the traditional narrative doesn't. I can forgive him for my own sake while still believing that what he did was wrong. I can release my attachment to his punishment while still thinking that he should face consequences. I can stop letting his actions control my emotional state while still acknowledging that those actions caused real damage. Most importantly, I can work toward forgiveness without requiring anything from him, no apology, no acknowledgement, no change in behavior. Forgiveness becomes something I do for myself, not something I do for him or even with him. It becomes an act of self-liberation rather than an act of magnanimity. Recovery from this kind of betrayal has been less about returning to who I was before and more about discovering who I'm capable of becoming in response to what happened. The woman I was before the betrayal was, in some ways, naive about the capacity for deception in people who present themselves as trustworthy. She was perhaps too willing to overlook red flags in favor of believing in the best possible interpretation of someone's behavior. The woman I'm becoming is more cautious but not cynical, more discerning but not closed off. She asks harder questions and pays closer attention to whether someone's actions align with their words. She's less willing to lose herself in the excitement of being chosen and more committed to ensuring that she's choosing wisely in return. This evolution hasn't been without cost. There's a kind of innocence that can't be recovered once it's lost, a capacity for wholehearted trust that becomes more complicated once you've experienced systematic deception. But there are also gifts that come from surviving betrayal, a deeper understanding of your own resilience, a clearer sense of your own values, a more sophisticated understanding of the complexity of human relationships. The process of rebuilding hasn't been linear or predictable. Some aspects of recovery have taken longer than expected, while others have progressed more quickly than I thought possible. Learning to trust my own judgment again has been perhaps the most challenging aspect, since that judgment was what led me into this situation in the first place. As I've gained distance from the immediate pain of the betrayal, I'd begun to see it as part of a larger story about power, vulnerability, and the ways that wounded people can either heal or harm in response to their wounds. His story, my story, and the stories of all the other women he deceived are connected by the ways that unhealed trauma can ripple outward, creating more trauma in its wake. Understanding this larger pattern doesn't excuse individual choices, but it does provide a framework for thinking about prevention and healing on a broader scale. How do we create communities where wounded people are more likely to seek healing than to spread their wounds? How do we recognize and respond to predatory behavior, especially when it comes from people in positions of trust? How do we support survivors without perpetuating cycles of harm? These questions feel more productive than the ones I was asking in the immediate aftermath of the betrayal. Instead of focusing solely on what he deserved or didn't deserve, I'm more interested in what can be learned from the experience, what can be prevented, what can be healed. This shift in focus has been part of my own healing process. Moving from victim to survivor to someone who might be able to help others avoid similar experiences has given the pain a purpose beyond itself. It's transformed the betrayal from something that happened to me into something I can use to help others. Years later, I still don't have all the answers I thought I needed when this journey began. I don't know if he's truly happy in his marriage or if he's simply better at hiding his continued deceptions. I don't know if his wife will eventually discover what I discovered, or if she'll remain willfully blind to information that contradicts the story she wants to believe. I don't know if he was actually abused as a child, or if that was just another story designed to generate sympathy and avoid accountability. What I do know is that I'm no longer waiting for those answers to move forward with my own life. The need to understand him completely, to achieve perfect justice, to see him face appropriate consequences, those needs no longer drive my daily existence the way they once did. Instead, I'm focused on the questions I can actually answer and the changes I can actually make. How can I build a life that feels meaningful and rich, regardless of what he's doing with his? How can I develop relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than manipulation and need? How can I contribute to a world where fewer people experience what I experienced? The journey continues, not toward a neat resolution or a fairy tale ending, but toward a kind of peace that can coexist with unanswered questions and unresolved pain. It's a more complex peace than I once imagined possible, but it's also more durable, more honest, more truly mine. In the end, that might be the most important victory of all, reclaiming ownership of my own story, my own healing, my own future. No longer defined primarily by what was done to me, but by how I've chosen to respond to what was done to me. No longer waiting for someone else's acknowledgement or consequences to give my experience meaning, but finding that meaning in my own growth, my own choices, my own commitment to living fully despite the scars. The story isn't over, but it's no longer a story about him. It's become a story about resilience, about the complexity of human relationships, about the possibility of healing even when justice remains elusive. And perhaps that transformation, from his story to my story, is the most profound form of recovery possible.